We see in Henry VI, Part 1, that the play opens with the funeral of the last king, Henry V. Several of the nobles file out onto the stage, and we see each of them offering different reasons for why such a tragic loss has occurred. The Duke of Bedford, the king's younger brother, suggests that astrology is somehow to blame. He asks the comets in the sky to scourge the bad stars that consented to the death of the king. The Duke of Exeter also throws out a suggestion of his own devising, and he thinks that the French have killed him, not by force of arms, but through sorcery and through witchcraft. And this is an interesting comment, given that in this play the French are resorting to sorceries to win their fights, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the Duke of Gloucester, one of the king's other brothers, he blames the church. He throws out the suggestion that Winchester and some of the others were praying for the overthrow of the king, because they only like rulers who are young, untutored, and effeminate, who can be overawed by the bishops and by the cardinals. And this is an interesting comment too, because it introduces the conflict between Gloucester and the Bishop of Winchester within the opening moments of the play. But I think that what this first scene does particularly well is that it depicts the different ways in which people deal with grief and with loss. It's natural to look for something or someone to blame when a tragedy happens, because it gives us, as Exeter's speech shows, something to direct our anger toward, a sense of purpose and somehow seeking revenge or justice as opposed to just wallowing in senseless grief. But while the characters are making these laments, they get a series of messages, one right after the other, bringing really bad news from France. They learn that the Dauphin, the French title of which is rendered Dolphin in this play, at least I think in most editions of this play, he's crowned himself king. And I mentioned that he did that in last week's lecture, too. They learn that many of the French cities that they had captured under the banner of Henry V have now been recaptured, retaken. And they learn that one of their greatest generals, Lord Talbot, has been captured, too. Now, the messenger who reports on Talbot's capture, he does a really good job of painting a scene of what happened in a way that shows us a lot about who Talbot is and a lot about who the French are. And also, it tells us where the weaknesses lie in the English ranks too. So it's a speech that's really packed with a lot of important points. The messenger says this: "The 10th of August last, this dreadful lord, Talbot, retiring from the siege of Orleans, having full scarce 6,000 in his troop, by 23,000 of the French was round encompassed and set upon. No leisure had he to enrank his men. He wanted pikes to set before his archers. Instead whereof, sharp stakes plucked out of hedges they pitched in the ground confusedly, to keep the horsemen off from breaking in. More than 3 hours the fight continued, where valiant Talbot, above human thought, enacted wonders with his sword and lance. Hundreds he sent to hell, and none durst stand him. Here, there, and everywhere, enraged he slew. The French exclaimed the devil was in arms. All the whole army stood agazed on him. His soldiers, spying his undaunted spirit, a Talbot, cried out amain, and rushed into the bowels of the battle. Here had the conquest fully been sealed up if Sir John Falstaff, we'll talk about that in a minute, had not played the coward. He, being in the vanward, placed behind with purpose to relieve and follow them, cowardly fled, not having struck one stroke. Hence grew the general rack and massacre, enclosed were they with their enemies. A base Walloon, to win the Dauphin's grace, thrust Talbot with a spear into the back, whom all France, with their chief assembled strength, durst not presume to look once in the face." So we get this picture in the messenger's speech of an English ward just wreaking havoc on the battlefield, like a demigod in the Iliad. There's just people following to the left and to the right of him. And it seems like he's unstoppable, and that he's going to pull out a victory despite being vastly outnumbered. But a couple of things. One, the French don't play fair. They thrust at him from behind because they don't dare to challenge him face to face. And we see that there's dissension and cowardice in the English ranks as well. A man, Sir John Falstaff, or Fastolf, depending on some copies, has played the coward and left Talbot hanging. Now, of course, this isn't the Falstaff that we've come to know already. In fact, this Falstaff that we're reading about in this play is a prototype, you might think, of, or maybe an embryo of the more famous one that we've already come to know. Remember that this play was written years before the other ones that we've already read. So it's likely that when Shakespeare was writing the Henry IV plays and casting about for a name for Prince Hal's friend after he was forced to change it from Oldcastle, you remember that we talked about why, he remembered this background character from one of his older plays and just borrowed that name for new purposes. And again, different editions of the Henry VI plays will spell it Falstaff or Fastolf. I think in later editions, Shakespeare changed it to Fastolf to avoid confusion. But we've also talked before about how there's some discrepancies in the text of some of Shakespeare's plays between when they were originally written and then when they came out in the first folio. So, Talbot, despite being this great man of war, he's overcome by treachery and cowardice. It also doesn't help that apparently the nobility is dividing into factions and arguing amongst themselves in England at the same time, and they aren't paying much attention to the war effort. All of this news that's coming from the messengers in Scene 1, it's taking them by surprise, and we might think, well, you guys are in charge of things. Shouldn't you know what's happening? Be keeping a closer watch on the war effort? But it doesn't seem like they are. And this is a theme that we'll see repeated throughout this play. There are those Englishmen who possess Henry V's warlike spirit, who would carry on his legacy if they could, but they're being undermined by the weaker, greedy, and squabbling Englishmen who are only out for themselves. So already, the nation is divided into these two groups, or two classes. And that's, again, something to watch out for. Which class does each character belong to? Are they a Talbot, or are they a Falstaff, or a Bishop, or a Humphrey who's squabbling with each other? But if it seems like Shakespeare is painting a bad picture of the English here, it's nothing compared to how he paints the French. In the next scene, we see the Dauphin leading his men to raise the siege of Orleans, outnumbering the English 10-1, and declaring that anyone who sees him retreating from battle has permission to kill him. That's a bold thing to say. He's saying, I'm not going to retreat. If you see me running, kill me. Well, immediately after, we see him retreating from battle and making excuses for why he did so. The French lords say that the English are all Samsons and Goliaths, and that they can't be tamed. And we can imagine that this scene was probably intended to invoke laughter and mockery from the English audiences who were viewing it. As I mentioned last week, there's a heavy English bias that runs through this play because Shakespeare is playing to his audience, more so than he did in the other plays that we've read, because again, he's a new playwright here, so he's trying to figure out what his crowd likes and wanting to please them. So, the cowardly Dauphin and the overconfident but then retreating French are clearly being presented here to be jeered at. Not only is the Dauphin a coward, he's also portrayed as love-struck, woman-crazy, and this is shown in the play to be a weakness. He prostrates himself before Joan La Pucelle, calls himself her thrall, her slave, And the way that he talks about her, it's like he's describing a goddess. And even the other French lords, when they see this, they kind of whisper to themselves that they think that he's going too far and that he's making a fool out of himself. So the contrast is drawn here between the English and the French and the characters, again, of Talbot and of the Dauphin. There's the brave, dauntless, manly warrior on one hand, and then the cowardly, simpering, effeminate leader who has to rely on a woman to fight his battles for him on the other. So let's talk about Joan La Pucelle, or Joan of Arc, for a minute. We learn that she was a simple shepherd's daughter before she had a vision from the Virgin Mary, telling her to drive the English out of her country. We also learn that she has the spirit of prophecy, like the 9 Sibyls of old Rome. And that's kind of an interesting reference, because it immediately undercuts Joan's ties to Christianity and aligns her instead with the soothsayers of the pagans. Joan could have been portrayed here, and she has been portrayed this way in other works, as a hero of the faith, an obedient servant to God. But Shakespeare instead starts evoking the language and the imagery of pagan magic. The account he has her give of herself does line up with what we know about her historically. She grew up in the region of Lorraine, was uneducated in all but the rudiments of the Catholic faith, and she started receiving visions when she was 13 years old, around that time. And at first, the visions told her to simply be a good girl, to do her Christian duties, and to remain a virgin. But as the years passed, they apparently started telling her to drive out the English, to become a military commander. And around the time that she was 16 or 17, she gained admittance into the French nobility and finally to the Dauphin, which is what is depicted here. Now, most of what we know about Joan's early childhood and the visions comes to us from her own testimony at her trial, which we'll read about a few weeks from now. And then, as now, some people have theorized that she was just insane. Everything has been suggested, from epilepsy to drinking unpasteurized milk. But keep in mind that the Dauphin would have known what signs of insanity to look for if that had been the cause of these visions, because his own father had been insane. Remember Charles VI, he thinks he's made out of glass. And so the Dauphin would have questioned Joan pretty intensely to make sure that he wasn't relying on the word of somebody who was obviously deranged. And whatever conversations passed between them was apparently enough to convince him that she was of a sound mind, at least of sound enough of a mind to lead an army. So her first major trial was raising the siege of Orleans. Some of the other French nobility, such as the Bastard of Orleans, tried to exclude her from the war councils, but she did have an ally in the Duke of Alençon, or Alençon, I think it's pronounced in the French. We might have to look that up. Sorry if I mispronounced his name. But in fact, he proved to be one of her closest companions and one of her trusted commanders. He believed in her almost from the beginning. And in this instance, he was able to make sure that her advice was heeded by the other generals, even though she herself was excluded. And none of this is alluded to in the play. Instead, we skip right to the night on which the siege of Orleans is lifted. Talbot, who has been ransomed back from the French, and the other English nobles are confronted by the French army, led by Joan, and they're forced to retreat. But not before the hero of the English and this new heroine of the French engage in combat. So Talbot and Joan fight each other one-on-one after he accuses her of conquering by fear and not by force. And during this battle, she holds her own. But as the French are rushing into the city, she follows the crowd and leaves Talbot fuming that she went away from the fight. Now, while all of this is going on, back in England, we see that the hatred between the different members of the nobility is growing. Gloucester and Winchester just about have it out in the courtyard of the Tower of London, and the mayor has to come and pull them apart. And what are the origins of this feud? When we look through the scene, there doesn't seem to be anything other than just baseless accusations between the two. Gloucester accuses Winchester of being a false Christian by giving indulgences to prostitutes and conspiring to kill Henry V. The first accusation probably stung the worst, since Winchester, we read, had just been promoted to cardinal. So you don't want to get this new promotion in the church and then you have these rumors flying around that you're pardoning prostitutes. So for his part, Winchester accuses Gloucester of being a traitor to the realm, of wanting to seize power for himself, and of dragging out the war in France as an excuse to tax the people. Now, this scene, it should be eerily familiar for readers who, like us, have just finished reading Henry V, because we saw the same pointless quarreling taking place among the East Cheap rogues at the start of the war. Remember Pistol and Nym? They're at each other's throats, and they're threatening each other for vague reasons, but there's not really any solid reason for them to be mad at each other. Only now it's worse, because while we might expect that sort of behavior from drunken thieves, this time it's the lords of the state who are engaged in it. And whereas Bardolph, himself a drunk, was able to make peace between Pistol and Nym, now the mayor of London himself can't make peace between these two nobles who are at each other's throats. So we can see that a degeneration of character has definitely happened here, a national degeneration of character. And it's what will lead to the civil conflict that's shortly to follow. And again, this sort of mirrors where we were at the beginning of this class. In the world of Richard II, there were still a few left alive who remembered the good old days and who were honorable, like John of Gaunt and the Duke of York, his brother. But they were rendered powerless by the schemes of Richard and his followers, and by the schemes of Bolingbroke in Northumberland. So here the same thing's happening again. History's repeating itself. We have the remnants of Henry V's time, the brave Talbot, but he's being thwarted by all the infighting and greed of those around him. So, for next week, read Acts 2 and 3 of Henry VI, Part 1, and we'll pick it up from there. Thanks.